Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. With this episode, we're back from our summer break with Season 3 of the podcast. Before introducing our guest, I'd like to take a moment to draw your attention to a couple of online events coming up soon that might be of interest. The first is an online workshop I'll be giving through the Archdiocese of New York Liturgy Office on introducing the Mass proper, chant and antiphons, to your parish, something that might be especially helpful in navigating the current norms on music in your diocese. It will be on the evening of Monday, September 21st in the year 2020, where we are now, and more information is available at antiphons.eventbrite.com. Another event will be the Sacred Music Boot Camp being offered online by the Church Music Association of America, October 15th to 17th. Topics are geared towards beginners, including the basics of singing the Mass, how to read square notes, how to start a chant choir, how to conduct chant, how to build a parish music budget, and much more. Each day will include sung compline and a spiritual reflection. Stay tuned at our website for a link to the forthcoming registration page for the event, sacredmusicpodcast.com. Click on Upcoming Events. Our guest for today's episode is the fantastic Scottish composer Sir James MacMillan, perhaps best known to Catholics for his music heard at Pope Benedict XVI's visit to Westminster Cathedral in 2010. Perhaps you've had the pleasure of singing or hearing MacMillan's Strathclyde motets or other of his music. His music, which appeals to a huge spectrum of listeners, frequently features Catholic texts and chant melodies. MacMillan is a devout Catholic and shares with us his insights not only interesting for the grasp of the compositional craft, but also because of their profound theological import, which is a result of thoughtful contemplation of art, beauty, music, and liturgy from a Catholic perspective. We're grateful to have him here with us today. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sir James. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Throughout recent history, papal documents on sacred music have typically held up Gregorian chant as a model for sacred music, and then discussed sacred polyphony as a music which complements the chant or agrees admirably, as Pius X says, and then gone on to discuss modern music as having a place in the sacred liturgy. Pope Pius X's motu proprio Tra le sollecitudini has a particular caveat about modern music, though. For example, he says in paragraph 5, "The Church has always recognized and favored the progress of the arts, admitting to the service of religion everything good and beautiful discovered by genius in the course of ages, always, however, with due regard for the liturgical laws. Consequently, modern music is also admitted to the Church, since it, too, furnishes compositions of such excellence, sobriety, and gravity that they are in no way unworthy of the liturgical functions. Still, since modern music has risen mainly to serve profane uses, greater care must be taken with regard to it, in order that the musical compositions of modern style, which are admitted in the Church, may contain nothing profane, be free from reminiscences of motifs adopted in the theaters, and be not fashioned, even in their external forms, after the manner of profane pieces." So, how do you think the composer of music for the liturgy in our time should navigate this distance between music and the liturgy that was created by virtue of the dominance of the secular and profane elements in the culture, in musical training, and even in the imagination of composers? In other words, how does the composer eschew these influences, and how does he form himself, perhaps in spite of them?
Well, composers that have written for the liturgy over the centuries, I suppose, have always been open to or influenced by the wider world of music. The world of the secular culture has always impacted on composers, some of the great composers who have written music for the Church in the past, and many of those composers have written music for both the secular world and the sacred context as well, going right back before Palestrina. And sometimes they overlapped, and sometimes there was a problem, and sometimes the Church had to ask questions about it. And maybe the church is still asking questions about how far the secular influences should be manifest and how much they should be controlled and so on. And we're refining the definitions more and more, though, and it became clear, for example, that a lot of the music written in the 19th century that was influenced by the world of opera, for example, became gradually more unacceptable or sat rather strangely in the world of liturgy. And so the church had to ask itself questions and work out how that might be resolved and improved. And if we can take that as an example, it was a reaction to the over theatrical nature of music in the 19th century that the church really got their minds focused on the importance of chant again. Because I think for many centuries, chant, or the importance of chant, the primacy of chant, had not been so emphasized. And it took perhaps a reaction to the over-secularization of music, and certainly the influence of operatic trends from Rossini to Puccini, I suppose, that the church was able to focus its mind again on what truly was music worthy of the temple, worthy of singing our divine praises. And certainly in the last century, I suppose the church has been focused on chant more than earlier, perhaps, and it's taken some great prophetic voices, including Benedict XVI, to remind us that the chant isn't everything, but it might be a kind of polar route, an anchor round which the church can think and rethink again the role of the sacred patrimony and how chant and polyphony and the great music of the past, the worthy music of the past, can inform music of the present and indeed music of the future.
So how would someone go about, do you think, forming themselves in this music of the past? You know, I think it's one thing for a composer to say, oh, I appreciate chant, and it's entirely something else to go about singing it day in, day out in a very liturgical way for, years as a real formation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, all that is very important, and composers need to, I think composers who want to write music for the liturgy, I think need to orientate themselves around the chant one way or another, and that can come through a practical engagement, through singing, directing a scola, for example, but the study of the chant and even working out how to feel the chant in one's own music, writing your own chants, for example, trying to imitate the rise and fall of that endless melody was certainly one of my very technical exercises when I was younger. And I didn't do that as a preparation for writing liturgy. I think I did it as a matter of course, as a means of learning about the great history of Western music, the antecedents of polyphony, the antecedents of Western classical music. I remember one of the most important things I did as a teenager was being asked by my teacher, still at high school, to write a melody that seemed like a chant, seemed like a piece of Gregorian chant. And maybe that's one of the first steps that composers should make, whether they're writing for liturgy or not. It seems to work. It's a marvelous way to prepare for the study of species counterpoint, which used to be part of the academic process of learning in many schools and universities in Europe, and I'm sure America as well. That seems to have been on the wane a little bit in recent decades. And if that is the case, that's a great pity, because I think composers learn about the basics through studying the counterpoint of Palestrina, or indeed the other great contrapuntal masters from different times in history. I think it's important for composers to be able to imitate a Bach fugal exposition, for example, because I think doing these, which are essentially pastiche exercises in composition, nevertheless, composers learn about the basics, they learn about the fundamentals of how counterpoint works. And I think that's one of the most important lessons that a composer can learn. You have to root yourself in the past. You have to root yourself in the tradition to understand it. And I think especially for composers of liturgical music, it's vitally important. You learn how line can work against line, how melody can work against melody, but you also learn just how important complexity is or can be in the writing of music, whether it's for a secular purpose or indeed for a sacred purpose. It's not to say that a composer needs to create music that sounds like music of the past. One can write choral music, liturgical music, using the language of our own time, but nevertheless has some of that DNA of the great music of the past. And the great music of the past, I think, is the great contrapuntal masters that we've been talking about. And at the root of that, the DNA of Palestrina and everyone else from that time is, of course, Gregorian chant.
Do you think there's a spiritual element that needs to come to the fore in that formation if a composer is seeking and doing these things that you're talking about from a compositional standpoint? What do you think a modern composer, perhaps that has not a great amount of contact with the liturgy or maybe a superficial contact with the liturgy, should do in the same vein to form himself, but really spiritually?
Well, that's a good question. I get asked a lot. Is it possible to write liturgical music if, for example, one is not a believer? It's a strange question, but it's a question that is a valid one, because a lot of non-believers actually write liturgical music, and that should perhaps spark some more questions. And some of my friends who don't share my faith have written music for the church or the churches, whether it be the Catholic Church or some of the non-Catholic churches, and it's a big question. Is it possible to write music for liturgy if one doesn't share the faith? Well, many of these composers, I suppose, have something in their cultural background which allows them to remember something about a liturgical engagement, perhaps. And sometimes that's enough, sometimes it isn't. But it might not be enough for us in the Catholic Church, and sometimes it takes that deep, practical, spiritual engagement, a spiritual engagement which is practical, a spiritual engagement which is a functioning, believing, practicing thing, to build up a sense of what the requirements of liturgy are all about. I mean, I write music for the secular world as well as for the liturgy, and I am aware that there is a difference in the mindset as I approach one and the other. And how would I characterize that? Well, there is something about writing for liturgy which has a deeper responsibility than writing music for the concert stage or the operatic stage. And it's a responsibility which allows the composer to understand that he's writing for more than himself or herself and writing for more than an audience. He's writing music which is meant to carry the thoughts and prayers and the deep reflections and contemplations of the assembly of ordinary people in the pew, sitting in the church, to carry those prayers and deep thoughts to the altar of God as a prayer. And that can work in a piece of choral music, and it needs to work in a piece of congregational music. And therefore, that's why I say that there's an extra weighty responsibility for a composer of liturgical music, because he has to see into the hearts and minds of the people who are using this music as prayer, as part of their prayers, their ritual prayers, as their prayers rise like incense at the altar of God. And that's a huge responsibility. And it's not necessarily a responsibility that the spiritually unformed or the spiritually separated might realize is there. But a Catholic composer has to realize that responsibility is real.
So even though it is possible, like you said, you get this question of whether a non-believer can write, it is possible, but there is something that is enabled in some way by simply believing. That is also in a sort of way, in that context, an aid to the compositional craft.
That has been certainly my experience. I tried to imagine what I'd be like if I was not a believer, and I wanted to write liturgical music which needed to find its natural place in the ritual life of the church. And I can't imagine myself being able to do that if I wasn't someone of belief. I can't imagine the deep motivation that goes with that, that desire to write music for the liturgy. A lot of my music, liturgical music, is mostly subsequently performed outside the liturgy. And that's a strange feeling too. And it's sometimes odd seeing and hearing music that I wrote specifically for the communion at a particular liturgy in the churches here being sung at a concert and applauded as such. But I think it can work that way. It's whether it works the other way, whether the mindset of the concert composer can dissolve itself enough into the mindset of the man or woman of prayer to allow the compositional craft to serve a spiritual necessity.
We would like to pick your brain a little bit about Pope Pius X's writings. Further, we brought them up already, but we'd like to stay with him for just a little bit because I know for myself, I find his writings particularly clear in teaching people about the church's teachings about sacred music. And so we're hoping for your perspective as a composer on these three qualities that Pope Pius X says are necessary. If you're going to include sacred music in the sacred liturgy, it has to have these three qualities. And so he says in paragraph 2 of Charles Solicitudini, sacred music should consequently possess in the highest degree the qualities proper to the liturgy, and in particular, sanctity and goodness of forms, which will spontaneously produce the final quality of universality. And then to describe sanctity, this first quality, he says, it must be holy and must therefore exclude all profanity not only in itself, but in the manner in which it is presented by those who execute it. So we've talked a little bit about sanctity in terms of the eschewance of profane influences, but I'm wondering if you could say something about the particular ability of music to point to the beyond, to be sacred in terms of being transcendent. Perhaps this is because, like the spiritual world, the phenomenon of music is invisible, leaving out here, of course, the elements that are visual and otherwise sensory in a performance. Why do you think music has this particular spiritual quality about it?
I don't know if I can really answer that question, but it is something that people who love music talk about a lot. And it's certainly a conversation I have with a lot of those people who love a discursive music and go to concerts a lot and find something they say is spiritual in that music. And when agnostics and indeed even atheists talk about the spiritual nature of music, we have to accept that they are onto something and that are perhaps acknowledging a truth about the nature of music that men and women of faith also feel, but would have different vocabulary and language to try to explain what it's all about. But I think when even agnostic and atheist music lovers talk about the spiritual nature of music, they are acknowledging something about the art form itself, which they might say allows us to see ourselves as something more than just the sum of our parts. And they also talk about the transformative nature of this music. And it's a music that, I'm talking about classical music, an art form, an art music, where they have to give themselves over to that music. They have to give themselves over in an act of obedience, an act of obedient listening to that music. And obedience is not a very popular thing these days. And there are many great pressures on the vast population not to listen and not to be attentive to something that demands our attention, something that has the authority to demand our attention, which is the unfolding of a piece of art music that takes more than 3 minutes to unfold. It can sometimes take hours. And to be in a state of mind, a state of soul, as it were, to be open to the transformative power of the authority of music, an authority that will not be hurried, is pointing to something of the mindset and indeed the soul set of someone who listens attentively to music. And it's something that we as Christians share with those music lovers who are not Christians, in that we know and feel something in the power of music that is transformative. And perhaps that's what we all mean about the spirituality of music. Perhaps that's what we all mean when we talk about the spiritual nature of music, and that it can indeed transform our lives. And people who do not share the faith say that too, that their lives can be changed, have been changed by that openness to music, that the music gets into the crevices of the soul in some way and brings about change. And that's a music that lives beyond the liturgy. Of course, we're talking about the secular world now, the secular world of the concert hall and the operatic stage. And if music can do that in the secular world, just think about what it's about and what it can do in the sacred temple as well. And so music written for the liturgy is all of these things and more, because it is associated with the act of prayer and the mindset, the soul set of prayer too.
What do you think are some of the unique ways that a modern musical language can imitate and communicate the sacred and the beautiful? Are there things you think are possible now for sacred music that perhaps weren't possible before because of, say, the development of harmonic language?
Well, I think modernity in music is attuned to the sacred, because music has always been attuned to the sacred. And when you look at the world of modernity in music, you can see a whole series of great composers through modernity, let's say the 20th century and now the 21st century, who have been on a journey and involved in the search for the sacred. And it's very interesting when it's pointed out that some of the great composers of the 20th century were profoundly religious men and women, from Stravinsky right through Olivier Messiaen, of course, and Francis Poulenc in France, right through to composers who are still living today, like Arvo Pärt, and many of those composers who came after Shostakovich, from behind what was the Iron Curtain in Russia and in Poland and elsewhere, Gorecki in Poland, and even people like Schnittke and Gubai Dolina, who's still alive, who were and are profoundly religious people. And it's almost as if that in reaction to the state-imposed atheism of the Soviet Union and the communist system, that some of those composers who came to the fore found their natural route back to God, found their natural route back to the search for the sacred. So maybe even in our own time, and modernity has been marked by profound catastrophes in Western society, like communism, like fascism, like Nazism. But yet, in music, more so than the other arts, that search for the sacred never went away. And so you can see in the work of these other composers how they developed their own musical language, which sometimes looked to the past, but sometimes looked to the vibrant present, and took music from the past and influences from the past, but also influences from around them in the world that is today. And they made music for God out of it. Some of it was written for the liturgy. And in fact, Stravinsky wrote music for the Mass. He set the Mass, he set the Psalms, of course. And some of it, most of it, was written for the secular world. But if you look at a composer like Olivier Messiaen, who I mentioned, here's a composer living very much at the heart of the 20th century, a major figure in the development of modernism in music, who was a teacher of Stockhausen and Boulez. But yet he managed to find a language which was very individual and very much his own, marked by the deep past as well as the vibrant present, to create a music that you have to say is very much part of that search for the sacred. And so when this is being done at the heart of modernity, and indeed in the heart of the catastrophes of the 20th century. You have to say that the development of music and new harmonic languages did not eschew the connection with the numinous and the connection with God. And the fact that something like the Quartet for the End of Time, which is regarded as Olivier Messiaen's masterwork, it's a piece of concert music. It's for piano, clarinet, violin, and cello. But this was a work that was written while he was a prisoner of war, a prisoner of the German, prisoner of the Nazis in the middle of the Second World War. And this masterpiece was written for his fellow prisoners, and Messiaen actually took part in the first performance in one of the German prisoner of war camps in France, Stalag, something or other. And his first audience was his fellow prisoners and also German camp guards, the Nazi camp guards. So right at the abyss of modernity, right at the abyss of modern political catastrophe, we are seeing an outworking of God's plan in music. And therefore, the musical language that is being developed and nurtured by the living composer may take very different stylistic and aesthetic directions. But it's clear that this search for the sacred is as vital now as it has ever been. And it's taking the sense of the transcendence of God right into the world as it is, and even when that world is deeply broken, such as the circumstances I've just described.
It's amazing to note the profound beauty that can come from, such evil, as you mentioned, like in the case with Messiaen in the prison camp. And I'd like to tie that in with the focus, or sometimes not focus, on beauty in music, and particularly in relation to sacred music. Pius X mentions that one of the qualities for sacred music should be goodness of form. He describes it saying, "Sacred music must be true art, for otherwise it will be impossible for it to exercise on the minds of those who listen to it that efficacy which the Church aims at obtaining in admitting into her liturgy the art of musical sounds." So I think, we can understand this as saying that sacred music must be beautiful. So what would you say about the role of beauty in music, particularly because it's not something that's necessarily a given anymore, but then also, perhaps say in the 19th century, as you were mentioning before, more of a, say, romanticized idea of beauty, or, in oftentimes in churches today, there can be a more, music is trying to be more catchy or superficially engaging instead of, profoundly beautiful and what beauty means. So how should the composer consider beauty in writing music that he's trying to make profound, and particularly in relation to sacred music for liturgical use?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't know if I can give a very complete answer, because in many ways the composer of sacred music has to find his or her own way to discover what this beauty is. And we have a kind of explosion of different styles and aesthetics in modern music now, maybe more so than ever. So that there's quite clearly not a single route towards this. And I've mentioned many composers already, and already, I mean, even those names point to a whole range of very, very different styles. And some wrote music for liturgy, some didn't, but they all imagined they were writing sacred music of some sort. Even the likes of Schnittke and Gubaidulina, who are profoundly religious people, but didn't find their music in the liturgy, but wanted to create music of beauty for our time. And sometimes that was a beauty that looked into the abyss of human experience and, in a sense, tried to redeem that experience for God. And I suppose every piece of music, every work of art that tries to make beauty out of something as horrendous as the crucifixion is a case in point that, it's within the Christian tradition, the Christian art tradition, to make beauty out of an act of destruction, an act of torture, an act of violence. And that might be the prime message here, that all Christian art, all Christian composers, all Christian artists, and especially those in this age of violence, need to look back at that primal moment of violence at the beginning of our faith, the beginning of our culture, which becomes the source of all beauty and indeed source of all truth and goodness. And without being diverted into discussions of style, aesthetic, or even practical considerations, perhaps that's all that the Catholic composer or the Catholic artist needs, is a constant reminder to himself that what he or she does in the act of creating art or in the act of creating music is engaging with the abyss. It's stepping up to the abyss of the crucifixion itself, the death of God, and embracing its meaning, embracing its reach into history, subsequent history, and subsequently into the depth of the human soul. So I suppose my answer is avoiding very specific, practical, and indeed stylistic questions about the nature of music. But perhaps I need to point to something deeper than that as a wider and more general reflection on these things.
So the last quality on Pius X's list is something that you've already touched at, but I wonder if we could dive more deeply into this notion of universality. On this, Pope Pius X says, but it must at the same time be universal in the sense that while every nation is permitted to admit into its ecclesiastical compositions those special forms which may be said to constitute its native music, still these forms must be subordinated in such a manner to the general characteristics of sacred music that nobody of any nation may receive an impression other than good on hearing them. So, of course, this is contextualized in the liturgy, and we think of enculturation when we think of this. But you could perhaps summarize this in a more broad way by saying that if a music possesses sanctity in the way that we've been discussing it, and beauty in the way that we've been discussing it, because those things are kind of hardwired in every human heart, it will have the ability to touch every human heart of goodwill, maybe regardless of background, culture, age, etc. So in your own work, it sounds like you have found this to be true, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this, specifically perhaps in the context of your own music and how it's opened up a path for you to communicate with people who might be very different from you or have a radically different worldview from you. And in that light, perhaps music can play a role in evangelization.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I, as a composer from the West, as it were, from Western Europe in this case, can only speak about music, the music that has shaped me and the tradition that has shaped me. I speak as a composer of music which has its roots in Europe, I suppose, in its classical formation. But that world of classical music has become a kind of gift to history, gift to subsequent history, a gift to the world, and has outgrown its Europeanness. It went to America first, of course, but now look where it's going, and look where classical music, for example, if we can talk about it in the secular sphere for the moment, look where classical music is growing. There are millions and millions of young Chinese musicians desperate to learn the piano and the violin and the cello to a very high level. And we can see these marvelous young musicians coming to the West and performing and studying here. Who would have thought that 50 years ago in the middle of the Cultural Revolution? That a music which is sometimes denigrated as Eurocentric has found a natural place to be nurtured and to grow in the Far East, in communist China, but also in other countries, Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and also in other continents with the whole growth of the El Sistema experience in Venezuela and throughout South America. There are more and more people outside of the Western experience, outside of the Western tradition, who are finding the great power of an art music, which did have its roots in Europe to begin with, but has now outgrown those roots and has become a truly universal phenomenon, a truly universal art form. And I suppose there's a parallel there in Christianity too, that, of course, the roots of Christianity are in Israel and it's in Jerusalem, but it very quickly outgrew that culture, became a European culture, and then became a world culture. And these point to the great power. These historical developments point to the great power of both Christianity and art music in their different ways. But we can never disassociate both from where they came from and the roots of these things. With Christian music, with music for the Christian liturgy, we will always hear voices saying that there have to be new cultural input into the growth of Christianity and indeed the growth of liturgical music, and that could very well be the case. I, as a Western composer, can only speak to my own experience, but I nevertheless see that. Let's go back to something like Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant was taken all over the world by the missionaries, and it settled in many countries far away from Rome, and indeed far away from Israel. And this music itself has become a universal phenomenon, has become a worldwide phenomenon. And I'm not surprised that many Christians, even when advocating for local forms of worship and local forms of music to be able to find its place, its natural evolution within Christian liturgy, will nevertheless point to the roots of Gregorian chant and the great affection that many Christians throughout the world will have for the universal language of chant and the Latin language that was sung to that chant, perhaps when we're growing up. There's a lesson there to the church in all its universality, in all its diversity, that it has roots. It has roots specifically in time and place, and we should always nourish that and celebrate that.
So, in that same sort of vein, a lesson to the church, what would you say to Catholics should do to be well-formed in music and perhaps the arts in general? And what can they do to dispel the sort of deforming effects of those works of music that they might hear even in the liturgy that aren't noble, that aren't worthy, not excellent, not beautiful? And perhaps another way of putting it is, how can Catholics develop a well-formed taste so as to be able to better distinguish between works of art that are excellent, less good, not worthwhile, especially when it comes to music in the liturgy? And how do we encourage our people to love and pray with beautiful music?
Well, to express an admiration for secular music is entirely natural, even for people from a religious tradition. But there is a time and place for secular music, and I think the church has always understood that. And Christian society and civilization has always given us place, a special place for the secular and secular music. Where there is a jarring effect is when some of that secular music transfers itself into the liturgy. And when it does that, it is not in its natural place, and people find it more difficult to celebrate the secular nature of that music when it's pretending to be of a sacred nature. And this is an issue that goes beyond style and perhaps beyond culture as well. But those critics of the secularization of the sacred spaces and the sacred liturgy, I think, are right to point out that secular music does have its time and place, and that time and place is not in the sacred space and not in sacred time. And those who value the liturgy would do well to pursue sacred music with deep roots, and to search out and to seek out how those deep roots can flower and bud in our own time, producing new sacred music for our own time.
For our last question, I want to focus on what you just mentioned, the producing of the new sacred music in our time. And particularly, I guess, any advice or encouragement that you could give to pastors, to Catholic patrons who want to help put their resources into building up programs of musical excellence, and to patronize composers who want to write music for the liturgy, and need an avenue to learn their craft to become capable of writing with excellence.
The problem in Catholic culture and in Catholic society is that there is a deep Philistinism in the church, which tends to see sacred music and indeed the arts, sacred arts generally, as some kind of afterthought, rather than something that should be profoundly central to the Catholic experience. And I think that's where we've come adrift, and that's where there sometimes has been a bit of a divergence from those of us who value sacred music in the liturgy and others. And sometimes they are pastors and they are clergy who have not been formed in the understanding of why music is so central to Christian worship and to the saying and singing of our prayers. And I would like to see in seminaries, but also just generally in Catholic lay life, a deeper understanding of what music and the arts can be in the life of prayer, in the life of prayer of the church. And rather than simply seeing it as some kind of added extra or some kind of entertaining frippery on the edge of the essentials, we actually see Catholic music and the artistic impulse as something absolutely central to Catholic liturgical experience.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I've found
You're
your
very welcome.
answers particularly insightful, not only from the depth of your experience in terms of what you offer compositionally, and so many of us love singing your music, but also there's a real spiritual reflection there that is a model, I think, for other composers, other aspiring composers. It's not just a compositional model that you offer.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest.
Your insights into composing music, particularly for the liturgy, but trying to incorporate all of the church's understanding of sacred music, I think are really, it's an insight that I think a lot of our listeners will find very profound. I know I certainly did in hearing you talk about music, and then it makes me want to, go back and listen to all of your music again, and try to hear it through the various aspects that we've been discussing.
That's very kind. I'm sure you are like me in that you sometimes must get frustrated with many in the church, and including our clergy and hierarchy, who don't quite see the importance of what we do, and it's trying to persuade our own side, as it were, our own team, that can be the most difficult thing for a Catholic musician.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
If you'd like to learn more about Sir James's work, there is a plethora of excellent recordings available. Also, you might want to check out the link to his works on the Boozy and Hawks website that we've included in our show notes page. Listeners might also be interested to read some new books on MacMillan and his work. James MacMillan Studies, edited by George Parsons and Robert Scholl, was newly released this year by Cambridge University Press. And The Music of James MacMillan by Philip A. Cook, published last year, 2019, is also insightful. 2, there is a small volume written by MacMillan himself entitled A Scots Song, A Life of Music. Please join us for our next episode, an in-depth interview with His Eminence Joseph Cardinal Zen about his life and the musical life of Catholics in China. If you're enjoying the show, we ask that you leave us a review on iTunes, which really helps others find out about our podcast. And until the next episode, may we sing the praise of his glory.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole. from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.